Today, we are honored to have the third President of United Republic of Tanzania, His Excellency Benjamin Wiliam Mkapa, who is going to talk to us about leadership and its importance for sustainable development. Your Excellency, thank you very much for your time at Uongozi Institute.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Maybe to start, which is extremely important, one will ask, given your vast experience, in your views, what makes a good leader?
Well, I would say in Africa, certainly, he has to be both a nationalist and a Pan-Africanist. He must be a person of learning, and I don't mean some academic qualifications, but learning in the broadest possible sense. Thirdly, she must be a person of integrity, disposed towards openness and interaction, in the sense of participatory leadership, in that sense, others helping you to lead. I should think those are essentially the key characteristics of a good leader.
It is very much believed, rather, that family background influences leadership styles and aspirations. In your own experience, how did your background influence your style and leadership disposition?
I would say it probably influenced me by stealth rather than consciously. My mother wound up being the eldest born. At the time I was growing up, there had been two elder children who had passed away. And in that position, she used to be the person around whom family contradictions used to be centered. And she would have to give counsel. And I noticed that she listened very carefully, and usually her decisions were honored by members of the family. My father was a catechist, and he liked to share knowledge, very much so. But also he was a very good listener, and that may also have influenced me by stealth. But again, they were able, in spite of differences always exist in families, in spite of their own differences from time to time, they were able to live together in conditions of tremendous integrity, mutual respect, and common regard and love for their children.
Your Excellency, you joined in the government as a journalist, and later in your career you assumed the role of High Commissioner in Nigeria, countries like Canada. You assumed even the role of Foreign Affairs Minister. How did this help you shape your leadership style when you assumed the presidency of United Republic of Tanzania in the year 1995?
The exposure to diplomacy made it easy for me when I was president to engage diplomats accredited to Tanzania, quite obviously. But so I learned the nuts and bolts of representation in those places. But I also got to know the politics and the governance of those countries, Nigeria, Canada, the US. And this helped me to understand how the world was disposed towards Africa and towards my own country. It was a good background to carry with me into the presidency. And I must say it was extremely useful in making it easy for me to make the case for Tanzania with these countries where it was necessary. But in addition, my stay in Washington, of course, gave me a little exposure to the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. And that also was good preparation for the time when I had to deal with them from the presidency.
You then became the third president of Tanzania in 1995, and you served your full 2 terms till 2005. At the time you assumed the presidency in 1995, what was your vision of the country as a president?
Well, what I wanted to do specifically was to lead a process of sorting out a series of very, very pressing challenges at that time. First, the challenge of reaffirming and strengthening relations with bilateral partners in our development, or bilateral donors, if you like, because those were immensely soured when I got into the presidency. Secondly, was to do the same thing with regard to the international financial institutions, and specifically because of the IMF and the World Bank, because we had overborrowed immensely and we were not paying back our debts. So those relations were also greatly soured. But I thought that the relations between government and the trade unions on the one hand and the cooperatives on the other, which institutions, national institutions, had been major pillars of the independence struggle. The relations with them had also been greatly soured. And therefore I came really to try to see if we could reaffirm or rediscover those working relationships, which are very important indeed for development. And then I also did know for a fact that financial discipline, fiscal discipline, and public expenditure discipline was somewhat low. That discipline was low. And that was also one of the reasons why relations, both bilateral as well as multilateral, had been soured. So I was determined to face up to these challenges. And I must say that we did succeed to restore those relations.
Do you think at the time you assumed the president, this vision was well understood by your assistant and public at large?
The public at large, and I think even the bulk of the civil service, were quite aware that we had major challenges or major problems in hand. Whether they thought I was capable of leading the effort to correct those shortcomings, and if you liked, to really mobilize the people to face the challenges, I do not know. I think they must have been somewhat hesitant, because I had not led a public life very much in the limelight. You see, an ambassador is a low-key person, however widely informed and decisive he may be. Although I had been a member of parliament and a minister, but it was in a ministry which does not acquire a very large profile inside the country. I was Minister of Foreign Affairs for the greater part of the time I served in government. And so I wasn't really known. And within the party, although I started off being the managing editor of the party newspapers, the Nationalist and Uhuru, as you can see, it is a low-profile job, however important and decisive it may be. So I think because I did not have that very large public image in the limelight, there must have been those who kept wondering whether this young man could really face up to these challenges that I have outlined.
With the benefit of hindsight, now you left your president gracefully. Do you think maybe you were a little bit too optimistic on what you could have achieved?
No, I don't think I was too optimistic. Why? Because having worked with the party, I knew that we could explain issues to the public, and with a government of integrity, you can mobilize the population to face any challenge. As Wiliam had demonstrated when we were invaded by Idi Amin. He spelled out the issues clearly, he called on everyone, and everyone felt that it was an honorable thing to do, to line up behind him and get rid of this invader. So similarly with these other challenges, I felt that with a party that is so strong, even though we were just breaking into the multi-party system, but a party that was strong, it had a network of workers, of offices, it had newspapers, and although it was a government radio station, but it could use that media also to explain the challenges, the problems that we faced, and how it would be done, and that it was not going to be easy, but that if we tightened our belts, we could restore the economy. I was confident that this could be done. But as I say, there must have been those who wondered whether I would have the courage to take on these problems. How
did you go about selecting your key assistants, ministers, their deputies, permanent secretaries, regional commissioners, etc., etc.?
There's no other way except to talk to your close associates in government, to get the instruments of government to vet the obvious candidates, to see whether they had performed their duties in whatever position they were with great integrity and competence, and then to produce the kind of political balance as well as competent energy to tackle these problems. It was mainly through consultation and vetting. That's how you get to decide. And then you produce the political balance, as I say, and the competence.
One of the challenges we have, Africa, Your Excellency, is for the executive to discipline the team. How did you manage, or rather, how did you discipline your team to make sure that they achieve what was intended to be achieved?
I think by setting an example, by I myself living up to the code of delivery that I was asking them to do, I think they realized then the kind of, I believe, serious leadership that I was offering. And therefore there was no malingering or anything. They had to work hard, to work with integrity, to deliver, to report, to review regularly. And so cabinet meetings were regular, party meetings were regular. They were well prepared for, there were papers, there were open discussions. And so they had to live up to this public examination, if you like.
So when you assumed the president in 1995, the economy was in a very bad shape, and a lot of macro indicators weren't good. So is inability of government to collect revenue where it was supposed to collect revenue. Did this add an extra pressure when you assumed the mantle of the presidency?
It did actually constitute great pressure upon me. And so what did I do? I just pressed for efficiency in the revenue collection processes. But in the end, I had to accept that the civil service had imploded too much. It was too big, and that it could be cut back to size. And then we had to set up the Revenue Authority, which we did, and empowered it sufficiently. In cutting the size of the civil service, I had to look at our bilateral friends and partners or donors and say to them, look, I can't just cut the staff and put them on the streets. They must leave office, even the incompetent ones must leave office with a certain degree of certainty about how they are going to live and survive with their families. Can you give me a grant that we can use to allow people to retire early if they choose to do so? And we did. So a great number chose voluntarily to retire because of the retirement package that I was able to put together through finances given by bilaterals. And that cut back on the government budget and helped to discipline expenditure. The other thing that we did do was to review the tax structure, because sometimes people are inhibited in paying their taxes because it is too cumbersome, the process is too cumbersome. Sometimes it is unreasonable in the sense that the rate is too high. And so I was able to meet individual big business people, but also their organizations, and talk very freely. What do you think of the tax structure? And they would say, this is a bad tax, this is a good tax, this and so on and so on. And from there, we would arrive at a budget that would not be agreed upon by them, but at least they would see that it is not an imposition upon them. So that's another thing that we did.
One area that perhaps there is a feeling about your administration is the way the privatization process was handled. There is a feeling, rightly or wrongly, that privatization process wasn't properly handled, and this may seem to be a criticism to your administration. I don't know how you respond to this criticism and whether this criticism is rightly leveled against your administration.
I have to say there was no alternative to privatization. There is this mythology that this public sector was performing very well. Those that were supposed to make profit, they were making profits. Those who were regulatory, they were regulating well. That is wrong. They were one after another resorting to the treasury to receive subsidies, or even those that were commercial enterprises, and that is not doing well. So we had to privatize. But how did we go about it? We set up the Private Sector Reform Commission, and they would look at the finances of one public enterprise after another, look at the figures and see how it could be turned around. They would get independent assessors of what the values were, the financial as well as the fixed assets and so on. And then they would put out to tender. It was open tender. And the commission would look at this, they would interview, they would talk. So it was not as secretive as it is sometimes presented. So that was a very fair process indeed. The only thing I regret is that after you have privatized, there should have been a greater effort to monitor the performance of these enterprises. That I accept. And to the extent that that is a shortcoming, it is a shortcoming. But it's not for lack of recognizing that it had to be done. It just wasn't done. That's it. So it wasn't done. Now, the other thing is, the other criticism that is lodged against the privatization process is that we are supposed to have privatized to foreigners, that it is the foreign bidders who won these enterprises. That is not true. A total of 330 public enterprises were privatized. Out of those 330, 180 were privatized to Tanzanian nationals, to Tanzanians, 180, more than half of them.
Yeah, over 50%.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then 27 only were privatized entirely to foreigners. The remaining ones, which is what, 80 something?
Yeah.
They were privatized on the basis of partnership. Tanzanians and foreigners together in a company bidding for it. So it is a myth to say that we privatized to foreigners. And of those, it is said that South Africans were most. I don't think that is true, because the biggest privatization I can think of was the Ilovo sugar plant in Kilombero. That was the biggest South African ones. But otherwise, what else did we do? So I know there's that criticism, but I think it's just a way out for. I know I'm not liked when I say this, I think, but by people who just don't like to think and face up to reality.
What was the single biggest crisis you faced as a president that you can recall?
I think for me the most difficult one was the effort towards the end of 2000 to change the constitution of Zanzibar in order to allow for an end to term limits. As you know, the presidency is limited to 2 terms.
Yes.
2 terms, to end the term limit. This was for me a major crisis because it ran counter to the philosophy of government of the party, and certainly it ran counter to the counsel we had received from our founding fathers. So that was a major crisis. I tried to explain, but ultimately, when it came to the crunch, we were able to overcome that problem.
Africa unit or United Africa as a dream, that has not been achieved. And of late, we are seeing some trend which we'll have to get your thought on this. For example, Sudan, the best they could have achieved is to separate the 2 countries. So is Eritrea. And now there is a likelihood Mali could follow. There's a section that want to separate. What are your thoughts on this? Why Africa now is going in the trend of secession?
I can only speak of the Sudan, yes, because I led the UN referendum observation team. The historians will tell you that in 1956, which is when the Sudan became independent from Britain, the South had already said that it was a mistake to consider Southern Sudan and Northern Sudan as one country. And they worked hard on the British. They even sent a delegation to Britain to tell them it is unwise. They deserved their own independence. And to show that really they were serious, 3 years later they started a war of liberation. So it's been on and off, the war on and off, all now until they reached the comprehensive peace agreement in Nairobi in 2001. So there it's not really a question of separation, it's a recognition of the reality at the time. The British ruled Sudan as 2 countries really, and it has just asserted itself. I have to say I'm very sorry that the tensions still continue between Sudan and South Sudan. I am hoping that the effort of the African Union to help them resolve these remaining issues of territorial boundaries, of revenue sharing in the oil business, and citizenship and currency and so on, they can sort these out. And it will be wrong in my view to think that only war can sort out that problem. No, that's true. That's not true. With Eritrea also, you know, Haile Selassie actually annexed Eritrea. It was not originally seen as part of Ethiopia. He annexed it, and the UN knows it. So altogether, it is not a surprising development. With Mali, I do not know enough, but I don't think there's a general trend towards separation. But what it does highlight, therefore, is the challenge, the continuing challenge of nation building. You see, independence created the states, but the nation building had just started. In the independence struggle, you just united to say to the British, go away, or to say to the French, go away, give us our independence. And it was a rallying cry that united everybody. After that, you start to build a basis for cohesion, a basis of cohesion, a basis for unity, and in some instances, because of the range of ethnicity in the country, it must be a deliberate effort to try to make sure that the unity is truly strengthened, that a sense of nationhood evolves. We here in Tanzania have been fortunate because the administration was not as rigid as it was in other countries, and therefore civil servants served in all parts of the country regardless of their ethnicity. Similarly, we had the common language of Swahili, and also the status of a United Nations territory also helped us to build that sense of nationhood. And yet, we in Tanzania still face the challenge of nationhood, particularly after the union with Zanzibar. What are the elements that keep us together, that necessitate we strengthen our unity, we recognize ourselves as a nation, not just as a state because we have a flag and so on. So for me, all these separatist tendencies are really an indictment of the leadership that it hasn't done enough to recognize that there is truly diversity, to build unity out of that diversity and enrich it with policy and with administration.
Your Excellency, what is the single biggest achievement you are so proud of as a president if you look back to your 10 years in the office?
Just one?
Single important that you can recall and say, here we did it.
For me, it was the, I don't know if we achieved it fully, but for me it was the sensitizing of this nation and its people to the realities of a changed world. You know, it was a bipolar world yes, until 1980 when the Soviet Union dissolved and so on. It was a changing world. The economies of the world were changing, and a public sector driven economy such as the Soviet Union or China was changing, and that we couldn't just abide by what had been pronounced at our independence or 7 years after our independence. We had to rethink. And therefore, I think I helped us to know, first, that globalization is not, however it was started, but now it had to be changed, and we had to be part of the changes of this globalization, because there's no way in which you could withdraw economically or politically from the world. That I helped, I think. The other thing I did was to recognize, or at least to impart the necessity of self-reliance, doing things for ourselves, what we could do. We were blessed in the first 30 years or so of independence, or 25 or 30 years of independence, to have many friends who were very generous in their assistance to us. I'm afraid we got into a mindset where we thought this was our right to receive this aid. But in fact, as I kept saying throughout my travels in the country, we had to rely on ourselves, because the Lord did not create other nations in order to help us. No. And so self-reliance. And for me, the greatest illustration of the capacity of self-reliance was the TASAF program, the Tanzania Social Action Fund. I have to admit, I learned of this possibility from my brother from Malawi, President Bakili Muluzi. He had started it there. But I realized structurally that we were more placed to be able to use this business, where the people of a community, whether it's a village or a ward and so on, list their priorities, the challenges as they see them for development. They list and they say, we are going to contribute 20% of the cost of realizing this project, and the rest will be received from the central government. But the administration of the implementation, the administration, and the financial management of the project is undertaken by a committee of the villages, of the people themselves. For me, this entrenched the notion that we can do things for ourselves. And it is for that reason that when we started getting surpluses on our revenues, I said we are going to direct them in the field of communications, to start building roads, because we were in the kind of attitude of mind that the World Bank, because it was the lead institution, they are going to build these roads for us. So that's how we started building the roads from Shinyanga to Nzega, Nzega to Singida, and so on, with our own funds.
Which leader in the world who is perhaps alive today or deceased influenced you most?
Wiliam Julius Kambarage Nyerere, obviously. I was very fortunate to have been identified by him as a serious worker, someone who could be trusted. I had just been in the foreign service for 2.5, 3 years, I think it was, when I got a call one evening from Wiliam and said he had been looking for a managing editor for the party newspapers, and he thought I could do it. I said, well, how can I do that? I haven't done this. He said, no, I think you can do it. We'll arrange for you to go to England for a couple of months to be attached to a newspaper there and see how it's working out, and then you can come back. So that was the beginning of my relationship with Wiliam. I came back, he handed over the papers to me, he displayed enough trust. I think we did a good case of advocacy with the party newspapers. And from there onwards, I became a party person, I became a member of parliament, I became his press secretary. At every stage, it was his influence and his hand that affected my life and my future.
If there's one question you will ask a leader, dead or alive, what question would that be? About leadership, if you have to ask somebody that you trust or somebody that you admire most.
I would probably ask them how to develop the skill of listening to others, because that is key to any participatory governance. You know, whether it is in the legislature or in the party or in the administration. You must be prepared to listen a great deal. I'm not talking about consultancy, although that is important, or even advisors, even that is important. But whether you have advisors or consultants or your fellow colleagues in government, you must be prepared to listen. And how you cultivate that skill to listen so that you use that knowledge and learning to govern well, that is the challenge that I would like to know.
Our time is running out, Your Excellency, but this program is watched by leaders in Tanzania and across Africa, both in the public and private sector. What will be your advice to the current leaders and aspiring leaders in our country as we build our nation? Because the nation will need both public and private sector.
Yeah. Well, in the public sector, I would urge that cooperation be more manifest. You know, one should always consider how one's work is impacting on another and how togetherness or cooperation can produce better results. You can distinguish yourself by going on your own and making your decisions, but in cooperation with others, you may be toned down or be worked up. That's the way it goes in the public. I think there should be more consultation, more cooperation, more discussion, and so on. But once that has been done, you must leave to the proper authority to make the decision and respect it. With the private sector, I should think there should be less suspicion of government than there is. The private really thinks that governments are oppressive. They do not allow them to express themselves or even to build their enterprises freely. And particularly the burden of taxation is always the point that is raised. I would urge them to be more forthcoming with their suggestions about how economies can be run or should be run, about the tax structures, about implementation projects and so on. They should have more courage to put this forward, and to do so with respect to authority, you know, not just in a condemnatory manner. No, we all have tasks and we all have positions and challenges in building this nation, and we must respect each other's responsibilities. Once that is done, I think countries can be stable. There is nothing that I hate to hear from the so-called developed countries, such as a description as a failing state, an unstable state, a failed state. We should never allow that description to be given to our country or to African countries.
Thank you very much. Viewers, I believe you have